Point source lights, in my opinion, and I think most would agree, that they're some of the most versatile lights you can have on set. For a couple reasons. Number one, a point source light inherently starts off as a hard light source. So with that, you can, with atmospheric haze, you can get those really cool light rays coming through a window or an abandoned warehouse or something like that. Or with a hard light source, you can cast really dramatic shadows on a background or whatever to just add a bunch of different textures and stuff. Or maybe even a really hard rim or edge light, or maybe even just getting really interesting lens flares. You can really only achieve that or best achieve that really with a hard light source as opposed to a soft light source. However, starting out with a hard light source has another benefit with the fact that you can change that quality of light by bouncing it or putting it through grid cloth or something to create a really soft light source, or even something as simple as putting a softbox in front of that hard light source. So with point source lights, you have hard light and soft light, as opposed to maybe an LED panel that just starts off as a soft light source. You can't really make that a true hard light source. Now behind me, I have a number of point source lights made by Aputure, who just happens to be my favorite lighting company. Really just one of my favorite companies in the filmmaking industry altogether. But that being said, I'm not being paid by Aputure. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that. So all these lights I've purchased with my own hard-earned money for my own company. And so I figured I'd make this video about point source lights and really specifically the LightStorm lineup of their chip on board LED lights, because really that's just because what I've invested in. So what I want to do is just talk about some of the different lights in that lineup, starting from lowest output all the way up to the highest output, and just a couple of use cases with the different lights. Now I'm not going to go over all the tech specs and not going to give like a review on all these lights, because that would make this video like 7 hours long, and I'm not Ted, so I can't go for that long. So what I want to do instead is just talk about some of the use cases and some of the scenarios in which I would use some of these different lights, and kind of where I would maybe recommend these different lights for different folks out there. But before we get into that, let's just real quick go over the D and the X moniker of these lights, because that can be kind of confusing to some people. So the D stands for daylight, meaning it is a daylight only balanced light. Typically the daylight balanced light are going to have more output than their bicolor alternatives, which are the lights ending with the X moniker, X meaning bicolor. Now the bicolor has an extended CCT range for these lights from 2700 Kelvin all the way up to 6500 Kelvin. So a little less output, however, you do have the versatility to change your CCT range. So now that we got that out of the way, we know the difference between the D and the X moniker. Let's go ahead and talk about the first two lights, which are the LS60D and the LS60X, which at the time of recording this, they aren't actually available to the public yet. They're not available to purchase, and I don't have any evaluation units or test units or anything like that. I'm just not that cool yet, but there are YouTubers out there that are cool enough to have that, so I can't wait to see your reviews. But I am cool enough to have a Grip Tips t-shirt, so there you go. Anyways, the LS60D and 60X are the lowest output lights of the bunch. However, I think they're some of the coolest lights of the bunch, just because of their design. Speaking of the design, it's kind of an all-in-one encompassing design. So all the controls and everything are built right onto the unit, and it has this nifty little aspherical lens on there, which you can spot and flood from 15 degree to 45 degrees. So if you're familiar with the Mini 20 lights that are now discontinued, these kind of replace those, but they're brighter and better like in every single way. Anyways, this is not a review of the light. Let's just go on to the use cases for this light. For me, the use cases for this light would be more of accent lights. So if I wanted to accent a specific feature or any kind of item or object in the background, just to kind of give it a little bit more life, that's what I do. So say I'm doing an interview with a musician in maybe their studio or something, and there's a guitar in the background. Maybe I would use that the 60D or 60X just to throw a little light on there, almost to make it look like a spotlight or something from the ceiling, just to kind of mimic that. Or maybe if there's a painting on a wall and there's an artist that I'm interviewing, I'd throw that light onto the painting just to give that painting a little bit more emphasis. But I'll really use that to create little accents and stuff like that. Also, it'd be great for like a hair light or an edge light or something like that. And with the 60X, being able to dial in that CCT range to add a little bit more color contrast to the scene would be super useful. Now, the 60D and the 60X are the only lights in this lineup that don't have a native Bowens S mount. They actually have things called a mini mount, so they're actually going to come out with some modifiers like the Spotlight Mini and I think a couple others that are specifically designed for the 60D and 60X. However, there's an adapter ring that you can get that you can be able to use all those other modifiers, the Spotlight mount, the Fresnel 2X, and the Light Dome Mini, and all those kind of the Bowens S mount accessories that are all used to with Bowens S mount lights, like the other lights that we're going to talk about in this video. And lastly, they are Sidus Link compatible. And if you don't know what Sidus Link is, it's basically, well, you can control all your lights from your phone. That's like the most basic explanation, but it's a really cool technology. Essentially what Sidus Link is each of these lights that are Sidus Link compatible create a Bluetooth mesh network, and they all kind of talk to each other and all kinds of cool programming stuff that I don't really understand. I just know I open the app and it works, and it's really cool. So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the next light, which oddly enough isn't natively Sidus Link compatible, which is the 120D Mark II. Now, of all the lights that I'm talking about in this video, the 120D Mark II is the oldest light of the bunch. However, it's still a fantastic light to have in your kit. Now, as I mentioned, it is not natively compatible with the Sidus Link app. However, it does come with a little remote, much like the rest of these lights do as well, to be able to control through a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi signal, I think it is. But you can control the output and turn the light on and off and all that kind of stuff. Pretty cool there. However, even though it's not natively compatible with Sidus Link app, Aputure also thought of that and came out with this thing called the Sidus Link Bridge, which basically converts that little 2.4 gigahertz signal into a Bluetooth mesh signal or something. Again, not a programmer, just know it works, and it's pretty cool technology. So if you have all these other lights in your kit as well, and you have that Sidus Link Bridge, you don't need to use this remote anymore. You can just throw it out. Actually, don't throw it out. These are actually pretty useful to have. But you can have it log into your Sidus Link app, either from your iPad or iPhone or whatever the case may be. And you can control the 120D Mark II like you would with these other lights that we're going to talk about here in this video. Now, although this light is older than all these lights that I'm talking about, it is still a great light. And if you look at YouTube, for example, content creators on YouTube, this is probably the most popular and ubiquitous light used on YouTube for YouTube content creation, just because of its reliability, its price point, and its color rendering, basically how well it reproduces colors, all that kind of stuff. It's just a really great light. And that's kind of where I see this light fitting in for most people. If you're a YouTube content creator and you're building up your channel and you want to be able to have a nice, accurate, reliable light that you can just plop a softbox on real quick and start recording, I think this is the light for you, especially if you're in a darker studio environment where you're not really battling with a window light or something like that. Additionally though, it has the Bowens S mount, so if you want to put things like the Fresnel 2X or the Spotlight mount or something like that, or the barn doors to cut and shape the light, you can do that, and it's a really good light for that because it's a much lighter weight light than some of the other lights that we're talking about. Mounting it up to a smaller light stand with the barn doors or something like that is something you can do with this light, which I mean you definitely couldn't do with like the 600D I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So like I said, for content creators and for darker studio environments where a lot of output isn't quite needed, it's a great light for that. However, if you want a little bit more output and an extreme amount of more flexibility, then I would recommend looking at the 300X, which is the next light we're going to talk about. Now, as the X moniker suggests in the 300X, it is a bicolor point source LED light. So it goes from the CCT range of 2700 Kelvin all the way up to 6500 Kelvin, which is really nice. And the cool thing about the 300X is it has this little thing called this color blending optics. It's basically like a little lens in front of the LED chip that blends the warm and cool LED chips together seamlessly to create a true point source LED light. So with that, you have the ability not only to use modifiers like the lantern and the light dome and light dome mini to soften the light, but you can still use the optical modifiers like the Fresnel 2X and the Spotlight mount that have a little aspherical lens in the modifier itself. Because you have that color blending optics, it still is a true point source light, so you're not going to get any weird shadows or anything like that. So with some point source bicolor LED lights out there, there might be a row of warm and a row of cool and alternating LED chips, but the problem is they're not blended together. So when you're using something like 4300 Kelvin or some mid-range CCT, you're gonna get these really weird shadows. As opposed to 300X, you're just not going to get that because they're blending those colors, those LED chips together to create a single point source light. It's like some real black magic trickery that they got going on, but it really works. So it's pretty awesome. Now, when compared to the 120D Mark II, the output of this light at 5500 Kelvin is only about 20% brighter. However, you gotta remember this is a bicolor light, and with bicolor lights, you're just gonna be sacrificing on output. Now, if you go down to 4300 Kelvin, you're actually gonna be about 50% brighter than the 120D Mark II. And if you go up to 6500 Kelvin, I know we're bouncing all over the place, but if you go to 6500 Kelvin, you're pretty much at the same output as your 120D Mark II. Now, the only time where you're gonna see less output than the 120D Mark II on the 300X is when you're at 2700 Kelvin because you're just using those warm LED chips. Now, just like the 120D Mark II, you can power this light via mains power or with V-mount batteries. However, the difference is with the 120D Mark II, you can only use one battery. With the 300X and the 300D Mark II we're talking about here in a second, you can use two batteries to power the light. Now, the cool thing about the 300X is that it has two different modes, if you will, on this light. So you can either have constant output or maximum output. The constant output basically means that no matter what CCT range you're at, whether at 2700 Kelvin or 4300 Kelvin, it limits the output of those LED chips to keep a constant output among the entire range, no matter what CCT you're at. So if you're trying to do a scene where you're trying to change from one CCT range to the other and you don't want to change the output, this is a perfect reason to use this constant output setting. But if you just want maximum output, click over to the maximum output setting, and then at like around 43 to 4500 Kelvin, where you have the most output, you're gonna have a pretty bright point source light, about 75% as bright as the 300D Mark II, which we'll talk about here in a second. And the max output setting is what I use most frequently, especially if I have my white balance set to 4500 Kelvin. Say I'm shooting an interview or a scene where there's a lot of tungsten practicals, and I can't change the color temperature of all the practicals. Maybe that's just not practical. That was a bad joke. I can set the light to 4500 Kelvin, bring my white balance of my camera down to 4500 Kelvin, just so that the tungsten practicals don't look so intense and so orange, but it still has that warm tungsten and still overall warm feeling to the shot. Having that maximum output at 43 to 4500 Kelvin gives me the ability to be able to still use it as a key light. However, like I said, you can still use it with the Fresnel 2X and the spotlight mount and all that stuff because of the color blending optics. So if you wanted to throw an accent back on a back wall or something like that, and you wanted to make it a tungsten source or maybe a cool source, maybe you're shooting a night scene or something and you want to mimic some moonlight coming in through the window. Well, if you're maybe at 3200 Kelvin on your camera or something, you can set the light to 6500 Kelvin and shine that through a window, and it'll kind of look like moonlight coming through the window. Now, if you're just looking for pure output and you aren't really concerned so much with the versatility, maybe you only gel light every now and again and you're mostly dealing with daylight balance lights, then the 300D Mark II might be a better light. And conveniently, it's also about $100 cheaper than the 300X, at least at the time of recording this. Now, the 300D and 300X physically share pretty much identical features. The lamp head looks identical, except the 300X has carbon fiber accents and the 300D Mark II has red accents, but the control box is pretty much identical, except the 300X has that little CCT dial on there and a couple of minor differences. However, otherwise, you're pretty much looking at identical units, except the 300D Mark II comes in at about $100 cheaper, at least at the time of recording this, and the 300D is just daylight balance, and it is brighter than the 300X. Now, the 300D Mark II, in terms of HMI equivalence, is kind of close to like a 575 watt HMI, so you're kind of getting into some pretty bright lights, so you can start competing with window light and ambient light and stuff like that, but you're still not going to be able to really get it to match the exposure of outside, especially at high noon or something like that. But sometime later in the afternoon or earlier in the morning, or maybe an overcast day, you might be able to use a 300D Mark II to kind kind of balance out the exposure between inside and outside. Now, as for use cases of the 300D Mark II, I will typically use the 300D Mark II, especially in a scenario where time is really limited and I just have to have a really quick setup. I'll use that as a key light, and I'll just throw the light dome in front of that to diffuse the light, and that'll be my key light. And then I might use the 300X or something like that as my hair light, so I can kind of add some color contrast or something if I want. But the 300D Mark II typically is what I'm going to use as a key light, or because it's so bright, I might use it as an exposure lift or something like that in the room, and maybe even just take off the reflector dish that it comes with and just throw light into the ceiling just to add more exposure into a room. But if you just want all the output that Aputure offers, then the 600D is definitely going to be your light of choice. Now, I have the 600D Pro. They are going to be coming out with a non-pro version of this light, I think sometime this year or maybe next year. I'm not really sure. But the 600D Pro just has some more pro features like wireless DMX and weatherproofing connectors and stuff that, as I understand it, I don't think the 600D is going to have that. It's going to be kind of more of a stripped down version of the 600D Pro. But anyways, holy output of the 600D Pro. It is freaking bright. It's equivalent of kind of like a 1.2K HMI or like a Joker 800 or something like that. It's a very, very bright light. Now, the quality of light and the beam of light is going to be different than a Joker and HMI, so it's kind of hard to compare those directly, but for simplicity's sake, it is pretty much comparable to those. And if you watch Luke Searville's channel, Meet the Gaffer, he does a comparison between that and the Joker, and you can kind of see kind of what I'm talking about. Same with Epic Light Media, if you've seen them, they do a little bit of comparison with the Gaffer between the Joker and the 600D Pro. But the moral of the story is this light is really freaking bright. So if you are in a scenario where you need to compete with output with say a big large window, say you're in an office building or maybe you're in a living room or wherever the case may be, and it's high noon outside and it's super bright, the sun is just bright and shiny and it's a beautiful day, the 600D Pro is going to be where you can start competing with that exposure to kind of have your talent exposed pretty much at the same exposure as outside. Now, one thing to mention and one thing to keep an eye on is if you're using the 600D Pro in the Light Dome Mark II, for example, in a softbox, like a 36-inch softbox, and you have that kind of where you would normally have it, like maybe with your 120D or 300D Mark II, keep in mind that 600D is going to be so bright and intense and that small relatively of a softbox that could be very uncomfortable for your talent to have that really small, relative small light source. Although it might give them soft light, it'll still seem really small and uncomfortable to them. So you might be better served using the 600D Pro with something maybe like a 6x or an 8x or like a booklight scenario or something like that, where that light source is much bigger and it may not be as uncomfortable as it would be with the 600D Pro. A great video to check out is Kevin Race's video. I think it's his 600D review, and he mentions that in his video, but he also shows the difference of exposure levels of, you know, lighting and talent with the 600D, the 300D Mark II, and the 120D, and you can kind of see the window light and kind of how each of those lights affect the exposure differently. But he does make the point about how kind of uncomfortable it was to really look into the camera. And I've shot a video with the 600D Pro, and it was not comfortable at all. So that is something to keep in mind with this light. But otherwise, yeah, it's super bright. Well, anyways, guys, that is pretty much it. I'm gonna stop rambling on. I'm pretty sure this video is pretty long. If you're still here, bless your heart. Thank you so much. If you're not subscribed and you're still here, I must be doing something right, so you might as well hit subscribe down below and then hit the notification bell next to it, hit the thumbs up button, and lastly, leave a comment down below and say, tell me what your favorite light is, and then also go to Kevin's channel and go troll his channel for a little bit and go to one of his videos and just tell him Tyler said to go buy an Easy Rig, and just comment all of his videos. Do that. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it informative. Maybe I already said that. If not, whatever. We're gonna end this video. Bye. Love you.